everyone, this is Rod Meldrum, the Book of Mormon evidence guy, inviting you to join me and historian Jonathan Neville in our epic deep dive into what Joseph Smith really knew about the geography of the Book of Mormon. Now this is part 4 of our 5-part series. I believe is the most intensive treatise on the subject that's ever been done. If you haven't seen the first 3 episodes though, go ahead and click on the links on the screen here and catch up on those first. But in this episode, you're going to learn about how some of the early saints were led to believe that Lehi landed in Chile by the Bernhisel manuscript. And we're going to also take a look at the claim that Joseph Smith's views on geography changed over the course of time. Did his views really change? And what about the recent idea that Joseph used a stone in the hat, or what we lovingly call the Sith theory, instead of the instrument that God had prepared centuries in advance, actually, the Urim and Thummim, to translate the plates. Okay, did he really use the plates? And we're going to talk about that. What did those who actually did the translation and the Lord himself, in fact, have to say about how this was done? And then we're going to lay out for you the behind-the-scenes history that exposes the true origins of the idea that the Book of Mormon happened in Central or Mesoamerica. In fact, have you heard of the smoking gun of Book of Mormon geography? And how the Mesoamerican theory was actually first promoted by men and leaders of groups that actually broke off from the mainstream church. Check out all this and more in our final 2 episodes that give you the full story of what the prophet Joseph Smith really knew about where the Book of Mormon actually took place. So strap in for another info-packed episode, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button below to stay informed about when our next videos are going to be released. Listen, thanks for watching.
Below comes as near the real fact as the 4 evangelicals do to the crucifixion of Jesus. Surely facts are stubborn things. It will be as it ever has been. The world will prove Joseph Smith a true prophet by circumstantial evidence in experiments as they did Moses and Elijah. This is a contrast. If you notice how those last 2 articles were written, they said we all through it. This article in the same September 15th, 1842 edition was actually signed at the bottom, Joseph Smith. And look at the difference of how Joseph Smith writes. He says, I now close my letter for the present, for the want of more time. For the enemy is on the alert, and as the Savior said, the prince of this world cometh, but he hath nothing in me. Behold, my prayer to God is...
This verifies what we've been saying all along. Joseph Smith was incredibly busy. Here, in his own handwriting, he says, for the want of more time.
Yeah.
You know, he is incredibly busy. He finally takes a little bit of time out and writes this specific article for the Times and Seasons. And it tells you that he's not doing all the rest of it.
Well, it's awesome, and I talked about this quite a bit in the book too. He's sending this letter to the actual editor. He didn't send it to himself. You know?
That's a great point. Yeah.
And there's lots of other indications of that. But
my letter for the present, right? Okay, go ahead. This is awesome.
Is that you all may be saved. And I subscribe myself, your servant in the Lord, prophet and seer of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Signed, Joseph Smith, at the bottom of this article. The other 2 articles are not signed. Both this article and the extract article were unsigned and written using we throughout. In this same issue, the article Tidings is written by Joseph Smith with his signature attached. In his signed article, as with virtually all other articles that were signed by Joseph Smith, he used first-person English, referring to himself as I throughout the article. This is strong evidence that those articles written using we rather than I were in fact not written by the prophet, but one of the other editors.
Okay, hold on.
This is October the 1st.
Hold on for just a second. This is the first time this just hit me. They used we because who is the we they're talking about?
the group
Benjamin
of
Winchester and William Smith.
Ah, very interesting.
We are writing these articles.
Yeah.
Not Joseph.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
But that's the first time I ever thought about that. But that's the reason why they're using the term we.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead.
1842, Zarahemla article. This is another article where there's an extract and then they wrote this editorial piece at the end. Since our extract was published by Mr. Stevens, Incidents of Travel, etc., we have found another important fact relating to the truth of the Book of Mormon. Central America, or Guatemala, is situated north of the Isthmus of Darien, and once embraced several hundred miles of territory from north to south. The city of Zarahemla, burnt at the crucifixion of the Savior and rebuilt afterwards, stood upon this land. Now that is a pretty factual statement. They come right out and say the city of Zarahemla was on this land, as if it was a established fact. But then in the next lines, they say this: we are not going to declare positively that the ruins of Catagua are those of Zarahemla, but when the land and the stones and the books tell the story so plain, we are of the opinion. Now think about that for just a second. How many times did you ever hear of Joseph Smith coming out and making a statement, a hard and fast statement like this one just did, and then said, well, in my opinion, we have to do this or that? That wasn't Joseph Smith's style. That wasn't the way Joseph Smith did things. That was the way of whoever this editor was, probably either John Taylor or Wilford Woodruff at the time, that actually wrote this editorial. That it would require more proof than the Jews could bring to prove the disciples stole the body of Jesus from the tomb, than to prove that the ruins of the city in question are not one of those referred to in the Book of Mormon. On one hand, this is Zarahemla was on this land. On the other hand, they say, well, we're not going to declare that really positively, but it's our opinion that this is what happened. That was not written by Joseph Smith. Some of the challenges with these accounts: Joseph Smith went into hiding from the unlawful arrest being perpetrated against him due to false accusations for an attempted assassination of Governor Boggs. This began Monday, August the 8th, and continued until Thursday, October the 20th of 1842. So Joseph Smith was in fact hiding from the law at the time that both of these editions of the Times and Seasons, the September 15th and October 1st editions, came out. This is the John Bernhisel letter that was written November the 16th, 1841. This John Bernhisel, who was a bishop of the church in New York, he became quite enamored with this New York Times best-selling book on the Central American civilizations that showed these grand ruins. And then he was desirous to give a copy of these books to the prophet, who was a good friend of his. Well, Wilford Woodruff was actually coming back from a mission over in Europe at the time and stopped in New York, and they apparently met and got the gift that he wanted to give to Joseph Smith, gave it to Wilford Woodruff, who then took it to Nauvoo to give to the prophet. Now, it's a pretty good possibility that Wilford Woodruff may have actually read some, or if not all, of these books on his way to see the prophet. We don't know whether he did or not, but then
we should stop
when Joseph Smith got the book,
because we know that he read them, because he wrote about them in his journal.
Yeah. But when I did this 15 years ago, that was before I had actually pulled his journals and actually read those,
right,
where he talks about that.
Yeah. But he talks about it quite a bit, actually, in there, about how impressed he was with them.
Yeah.
So anyway, just to
so that's why I kind of was assuming at this point in time that maybe it was Wilford Woodruff that had done that, but I didn't know for sure because I hadn't pulled the journal. Right. Go ahead.
Then a while later, then he had a letter that was written in November the 16th of 1841, and this is what the letter says. This is Joseph Smith thanking John Bernhisel for the gift of the books. I receive your kind present by the hand of Elder Woodruff, and feel myself under many obligations for this mark of your esteem and friendship, which to me is the more interesting as it unfolds and develops many things that are of great importance to this generation and corresponds with and supports the testimony of the Book of Mormon. I have read the volumes with the greatest interest and pleasure, and must say that of all the histories that have been written pertaining to the antiquities of this country, it is the most correct, luminous, and comprehensive. What most people who use this as an evidence that Joseph Smith's mind was changing on the geography of the Book of Mormon to a Mesoamerican setting, that they don't normally tell you is that this letter is acknowledged by church historians to have been written not by Joseph Smith, but by John Taylor, who wrote the letter for Joseph Smith. Now, it is not known if Joseph Smith actually proofed the letter that was being sent. It could be as simple as that Joseph Smith said, "Would you please write a letter to John Bernhisel and thanking him for the books," in which John Taylor then wrote the letter and sent it off. And John Taylor, who never claimed to have received any revelation on the geography of the Book of Mormon, was also one of the editors of the Times and Seasons, and is well known by historical documents that he was quite enamored with Stephen's book, and in fact had written other articles and so forth in regard to that. Now, there's one section that I'd like to return back to in this, because I think this is important. This is from the letter from Joseph Smith to John Bernhisel. It says, "Of all the histories that have been written pertaining to the antiquities of this country, it's the most correct, luminous, and comprehensive." What country are we talking about here? What did the prophet mean by this country? If the Book of Mormon is a historical record of the civilizations of Central America, why would Joseph Smith consider Stephen's book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, to be the most correct, luminous, and comprehensive history of this country rather than the Book of Mormon itself? If the Book of Mormon is a history of Central America, then would not it be the most comprehensive, correct, and luminous of that country? And what country are we talking about? Well, it's talking about Central America, because that's the name of Stephen's book. So you see how that doesn't really match. Joseph Smith would have certainly thought the Book of Mormon to be the most comprehensive of this country. This is John M. Bernhisel in regard to the Bernhisel manuscript. Before the prophet's death, he was working on an inspired version of the Bible and had his manuscript and his notes there. And then he was killed, and John Bernhisel asked the prophet's wife, Emma, if he could take those notes and transcribe them for the prophet. And the following is actually was written in the margins of those notes that John Bernhisel was doing. Revelation given to the prophet Joseph Smith, the exact date this revelation was given is not known, but it is possible that it was given during the dedicatory services of the Kirtland Temple in March of 1836. This is not good evidence when you don't have a source document and we don't even know the date or what it was. In other words, it might have been this. The course that Lehi traveled from the city of Jerusalem to the place where he and his family took ship, they traveled nearly a south-southeast direction until they came to the 19th degree of north latitude, then nearly east to the Sea of Arabia, then sailed in a southeast direction and landed on the continent of South America in Chile, 30 degrees south latitude. And this was in the Bernhisel manuscript, page 135. This was actually written in the hand of Frederick G. Williams, according to historians. It has no heading, is not attributed to either Joseph or Revelation, and yet it has been assumed by many to have been received by the prophet Joseph Smith, that somehow Lehi landed in Chile, in South America. There's no historical precedence for that. There's no historical evidence for that. This is actually from Robert J. Matthews, BYU Studies, Volume 11, 1971. He said that the Bernhisel manuscript is an interpretive copy of the originals and could not have been the basic source for the Moses and Matthew materials in either the 1851 or 1878 editions of the Pearl of Great Price. Dr. Bernhisel did not make a simple transcription of the originals, but did some adaptation, interpreting, judging, thinking for himself. He also made some explanatory comments beyond the content of the original documents that he was copying. What some have thought is that these articles in 1842 and 43 that talk about the Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon are thought that Joseph Smith was slowly changing over from a North American setting for the Book of Mormon, which he clearly indicated back in 1832 and 33 when he sent the missionaries and so forth there to the Indians in the West and so forth, and that Joseph Smith's mind was slowly changing over into the Central American setting. In his book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, Dr. Sorensen has this quote.
that last part that we just were talking about, I mentioned it was in the margins of the Bernhisel manuscript, and actually that technically is incorrect. A friend of mine, actually, Mark Harvey, actually wrote to the church history department and said, so what about that? And they basically said, no, it's not in the margins, but it was in there. But they acknowledged that it was not Joseph Smith. It was, it was written by Frederick G. Williams and so forth, and so they acknowledged that as the case. So, anyway, that's one that I've had brought up to me a lot about that, because that got perpetuated on in other church documents and so forth, that they landed in Chile, 30 degrees south parallel, and so forth, and it was thought it was Joseph Smith again. It's kind of interesting. Everybody wants to claim it was Joseph Smith, but the only things that you can really show that was Joseph Smith completely contradicts the stuff that doesn't. And so I love the fact that we have enough information from Joseph Smith himself that we can actually now we can determine what was his and what wasn't his, and try to, now we have to try to remove all those things from the church history that claimed it was Joseph.
Yeah, well, it goes back to your hierarchy of evidence. Two other things about Bernhisel, though, before we leave that. One is this idea of the 30th degree of latitude.
Yeah.
If Joseph had just said 30th degree of latitude, and everybody assumed it was South America, but where is it in North America?
About 30 degrees north latitude.
I know, but where is that? It's in Florida,
Florida,
right?
yeah.
Which is what we think it is. And it's where the ocean currents show, it's where the Phoenicia went. There's lots of extrinsic evidence to support the 30 degree latitude north.
Yeah.
And there's zero extrinsic evidence to support 30 degrees south. It just doesn't make sense. The other thing about Bernhisel that's interesting, this letter comes up all the time. And so I have a whole chapter on it in the book, because Wilford Woodruff, we know he read the letters, or the books, because he talked about them, he loved them. The first time he mentions in his journal seeing Joseph Smith was October 31st. This letter was dated November 16th, and they're both thick volumes. So the idea that Joseph Smith read both of those books in 2 weeks is just not credible.
Yeah, he's too busy.
Nobody mentioned him reading them ever.
And we know a little bit about what he really thought about the books later on. The more information that you brought out, because they ended up where?
Well, he donated them to the library, but
he didn't donate all of his books to the library. Only those that he didn't want to keep.
Well, who knows about that? That's a little speculative. But getting back to this letter, though, it's really interesting, because Wilford Woodruff in his journal said he wrote a letter to Dr. Bernhisel, but no one knows where that letter is. And the only letter that goes to Dr. Bernhisel that we know of is this November 16th letter. And that's about the time that Woodruff said he wrote a letter. So when I looked at that, I said, well, the other thing is... So it wasn't
John Taylor, it was Wilford
Woodruff? Well, it's John Taylor's handwriting.
Right.
So what I assume is, based on the evidence, is that Joseph Smith looked at these books, says, oh, this is great, send him a thank you note, and Wilford Woodruff drafted a little thank you note.
Maybe he didn't even read them.
Well, what you showed here was...
Woodruff had read them.
Wilford had.
Yeah.
So Wilford could say all that stuff.
Yep.
But you didn't show the entire letter, because the second part of the letter talks about a land transaction.
Yeah.
So I compared that letter to all the previous correspondence between Joseph Smith and Bernhisel, and all the other correspondence is consistent the way it's written. This letter stands out as completely different. So that's another indication that Joseph Smith didn't even dictate it. He just told the guys, send him a thank you note, and Wilford Woodruff used his own enthusiasm about the book and put it in there.
Yeah.
And so, and then there's other things having to do with what's on the envelope and stuff that corroborates all this. One other thing, it pointed out that, according to the letter, it said it was, what was the term? It was the most correct history. Well, it said most correct history, right?
Yeah.
And the famous statement that's attributed to Joseph Smith is the Book of Mormon is the most correct book.
Yeah.
But that's a false quote. And people, I still see it all the time.
Yeah.
It's even in the introduction to the Book of Mormon, but it's a fake quote, because what it was Wilford Woodruff in his journal had an all-day meeting with Joseph Smith, and he summarized it in that sentence where he said, Joseph told the brethren is the most correct book and all that. He didn't even put it in quotes. It was Wilford Woodruff's summary of what Joseph Smith said.
during that day.
And when you see that same phrase in this Bernhisel letter, it looks to me like that's Wilford Woodruff yet again, writing on behalf of someone else when he says the most correct. But you brilliantly pointed out here that for Joseph Smith to say that this is the most correct history, but the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on earth, that's inconsistent.
They have to be two different countries he's talking about then.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, the Book of Mormon would clearly be the most comprehensive.
Yeah. And the other...
That was one thing that just hit me when I was doing the research.
That's right.
Like, why would he think that's the most correct book?
Yeah. Well, and the global picture is that, in a sense, all the Mesoamerican stuff is evidence of the Book of Mormon, post-Book of Mormon time periods.
Yeah.
Because the Lamanites survived, they expanded, went down there, integrated with the Mayans and all that stuff. So that's evidence of a great civilization.
And we've long said that the evidence is pretty, well, I guess there's some anecdotal evidence and so forth there, but Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and so forth.
All that stuff.
And we know that Christ, when he was with the Nephites, he said, I just came from Jerusalem, now I'm here with you, and the Father has commanded me to go to other sheep. So we say that these are some of the other sheep.
Pull up that lesson manual.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
Okay. These are the other sheep.
The other sheep.
The other sheep. These aren't the Nephites. These are his other sheep.
These are the Mayans.
The Mayans he visited.
Correct.
No problem.
Although if this temple was Chichen Itza in the background, it would be 900 AD, which is when that was built. But
that one's not Chichen Itza.
So maybe it came later on.
Plus you've got the mountains of Peru down here.
Yeah, the mountains of Peru.
So he visited the people in Peru. That's no problem.
And my sister served a mission in Sendai, Japan, and they have a history of a bearded god coming down to visit them and so forth. So I think that Christ actually, not to be flippant about it, but he kind of went on tour. He went to many different people.
You mentioned the Russian painting and the history.
That's right.
So when I look at this, I think, okay, this is a depiction of what the Book of Mormon teaches about Christ visiting people all around the world. Could just as well have been Japan or Russia in the background. Has nothing to do with the text of the Book of Mormon. It has nothing to do
Although if they had a picture of him with the Kremlin in the background, we would know that's chronologically challenged as
fair
well.
Enough. But so that's why people get upset about this as depicting the geography of the Book of Mormon. I say this has nothing to do with the geography of the Book of Mormon. This is depicting Christ visiting other sheep around the world. And so it could easily be in Persia or somewhere.
Yeah.
So that's one way to interpret it.
Yeah, there you go.
So that letter, the Bernhisel letter, I hear about all the time.
Yes.
And I say, well, dude, just read it. Compare it to the other letters he sent. Compare it to where's the letter that Wilford Woodruff actually sent to Bernhisel?
Is there anybody that still believes that was really him?
Well, the Maso guys do.
They still.
Oh yeah,
even though they know it was written in not in Joseph's handwriting. And
they
all
still
kind of
do.
stuff. Well, I guess it's the last thing that they really have to hang on to. Maybe I don't know.
Well,
maybe that's it.
I mean, I hear from them, and I say, okay, I'm happy for people to believe whatever they want.
Yeah.
We can just agree. Here are the facts. This gets to that faith model I talk about all the time. We can all agree on the facts that Wilford Woodruff read it, that he said he wrote a letter to Bernhisel that we don't have, and that there is a letter to Bernhisel at the same date that we do have. And then you can say, well, he was talking about a different letter, and this one was really Joseph Smith, even though Joseph Smith didn't have time to read it. You look at all the facts, and once you separating the assumptions away, then it becomes real clear which assumptions are more plausible.
This is one of the things that when I did this video, because I felt like I had been gut punched. Because when I was finding out this stuff from actual a deep dive study into the church history, I felt like, I was never told this. I was never explained that, and so forth and so on, which is part of the reason why I wanted to bring these up, because there's nothing that we're trying to hide.
Right.
There's nothing that we're leaving out, as far as I know. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, anything that's promoting the Central American theory, we're telling you about it right now.
Right.
And then we're also trying to give it some historical perspective and so forth, so you can make up your own mind what you think really happened.
Exactly.
But if you, this is the thing that was so aggravating, really, and that is that if you leave things out deliberately so that you can push a particular agenda. See, we're having to. I had to hit this thing head on, because if I'm going to be guilty of doing what has been done in the past, which is to leave stuff out in order to promote a particular idea, then I'm just as guilty as anyone else.
I totally agree. And that's why in this book, I have all these articles spelled out and explained, addressed.
That's what I love about
Didn't hide any of it.
Fully referenced. I mean, you can you can look up every single thing, almost everything you have found, you can find in the Joseph Smith papers. So it's right there.
And that's why, this, we can get back to the Wentworth letter and how they omitted the part that Joseph talked about the Indians.
Aboriginal inhabitants of this country.
This omits what Lucy Mack Smith said that contradicts the Meso. So that their whole methodology of promoting Mesoamerica is by omitting evidence. It's not by addressing the evidence. Because when people find out what Lucy actually said and Oliver Cowdery said,
and they go, what?
Well, how come I haven't been told this? And then it all makes sense. And it relates back also to what the critics of the church have, that the Heartland approach addresses those issues as well, which we don't have time to get into now, but in the future we will.
Well, it's just kind of like the old adage, the truth will make you free.
Yeah.
It has never been more apropos.
That's right.
Okay, let's go ahead. Let's finish this up.
And this is on page number 1 of this book. The historical sources give no indication that Moroni's instructions to young Joseph Smith included geography, nor did Joseph Smith claim inspiration on the matter. That is simply historically not correct.
Let's stop there
Ideas
for a
he
second.
later expressed.
Okay, because we've shown several
over and over again
that the historical sources give explicit indication that it was Moroni himself who identified the Gomorrah. I mean, this is so exasperating. It's so basic and obvious, and yet here's John Sorensen, who's well-educated, he knows his stuff. He was either ignorant of it or he's deliberately misleading people.
By the way, my bookshelves in the back here, you can see there's that book right there. I think I'll pull it off right here. All the books on the bottom shelf right over here and coming over onto this side and coming up onto this side are all the Mesoamerica books that have been published. I don't know if it's all of them, but a good share of them, the most important ones and so forth, are down there. And so it's not like I'm completely ignorant or that we are ignorant of what they're saying. I think we're pretty up to speed on to what they're saying.
But I talked earlier about this book, didn't I? I can't remember if I talked
about ancient American setting for the Book of Mormon.
About how he sent it around as for peer review, and a friend of mine got it and gave me a copy. Did I talk about that today?
I actually have 2 copies of what was being sent around, so I don't know how many. I mean, they're in my stuff.
The photocopied ones?
Yeah, the photocopied ones.
Yeah. So I couldn't remember if I talked about that or not, but I was so into this. I was living in Santa Fe. I was working for the Supreme Court down there. And a friend of mine in the ward was an archaeologist and a friend of John's. So John sent him that preliminary manuscript to go over, and he knew I was interested in this stuff. So he and I went through that whole thing, and I made the copy of it. And I was totally bought into it. Because as apparently John,
it was really the definitive work at the time.
Yeah,
the most authoritative work that had been done.
But see, John here says historical sources give no indication that Moroni's instructions included geography. So he was either ignorant of the historical sources, which we've already shown here, and you can read in the
or dismissing them,
or he ignored them, or he had been persuaded that they were invalid or something. So this is an example of where people can read his book and be persuaded because they just lack the knowledge of the church history.
Well, the second part of that is, nor did Joseph Smith claim inspiration on the matter.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
We just gave, what, a half a dozen or more examples where he specifically did claim inspiration and revelation and visitation and vision of these things.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay.
Go ahead.
About the location of events reported in the book apparently reflected his own best thinking, meaning that since Joseph Smith made these comments in 1832 and 1833 and so forth, and then later appeared to be changing his mind in the Times and Seasons with unsigned articles that were written by editors who wrote in a completely different manner than Joseph Smith, that his views on the matter were evolving. These are LDS scholars discounting or disdaining Joseph Smith's knowledge of Book of Mormon geography. I've deliberately withheld the references because this is not about the individuals and their statements specifically. This is about where these individuals had to go in order to help understand that Joseph Smith may have been changing his mind and moving from a North American setting where the Hill Cumorah actually was to a Central American setting. And since Moroni offered Joseph Smith only a brief sketch, it is unlikely that he revealed to Joseph a comprehensive knowledge of Native American origins. Another one writes, "It is important to understand that Joseph Smith did not have access to this knowledge. He translated the book, but apparently did not know the scope of its geography. Exactly what Joseph Smith believed at different times in his life concerning Book of Mormon geography in general is also indeterminable." Evidently, Joseph Smith's views on this matter were open to further knowledge, meaning that as he learned more from Stephen's book, that he then made the switch over from North America into Central or Mesoamerica. Did Joseph Smith's understanding of the location of the Lamanites actually evolve? This is from Joseph Smith's own diary, 1 month before
I have to
he was
stop
killed.
for just a half a second here. So this is something that was like manna from heaven. Okay, so one of the great church historians is Andrew Ehat, and he and I had some correspondence back and forth as I was searching for these things and trying to get information and understand more of the background of what was going on. And then one day, just out of the blue, I can't remember if it was a phone call or I think it was a phone call from Andrew Ehat, and he said, "Rod," he says, "I've got something here that I think you're going to find important."
Okay.
This is literally right before I was pretty much done with my presentation. It was just right before. That's part of the reason why this is right at the end of this. But he knew about this idea that Joseph Smith was changing his mind, right? He was evolving. And he said, "I've got a reference that you're going to need to know about, and it's not in most reference books. It says, but I've discovered this." So I have to give credit to Andrew Ehat.
Okay.
There's a shout out to Andrew Ehat. I know he wrote Joseph Fielding Smith wrote the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, and a lot of that is actually not established that was Joseph Smith's stuff.
For sure.
So Andrew Ehat wrote the writings of the prophet Joseph Smith, and that one is authoritative. Everything that's in that book is the actual stuff that we know came from Joseph Smith.
I think it's called The Words of Joseph Smith.
I think that was
That's
the later version,
Yeah.
the last version of that.
Yeah.
But you can get that copy and so forth. But now we have with the Joseph Smith papers, it's been all corroborated anyway. But I just wanted to give that information. That was a little piece of manna that he got to me right before we finished doing this video 15 years ago.
Okay.
This is Thursday, May the 23rd of 1844. 1 p.m. Held council with the Indians, Sack and Fox, in my back kitchen. They had some questions about selling their land, and Joseph Smith advised them not to sell their land anymore. I replied, "Great Spirit wants you to be united and live in peace. I found a book," presenting them with the Book of Mormon, "which told me about your fathers, and Great Spirit told me. You must send to all the tribes you can and tell them to live in peace. And when any of our people come to see you, treat them as we treat you." Was Joseph Smith's knowledge actually evolving? Because he went right back to the same Indians that he had before. Ronald W. Walker, who is a wonderful historian of the church, in Journal of Mormon History, 1993, Seeking the Remnant, the Native American in the Joseph Smith period. There were a few last events that gave his, meaning Joseph Smith's, career symmetry. He had begun preoccupied by the Lamanite and interested in the West, and his final days had similar themes. 5 days before his death, Smith and his closest associates passed over the Mississippi River. Standing on a small house frame, he spoke to his followers before going to fateful Carthage. "You will yet be called to go to the strongholds of the Rocky Mountains," Smith predicted. "You will gather the red man from their scattered and dispersed situation to become the strong arm of Jehovah." Where were these red men that Joseph Smith was talking about? He knew that they were going to the west, to the Rocky Mountains, which is again in North America, in the Promised Land. Brother Walker continues, "The millennial Book of Mormon expectation of the Lamanite, so bright and exciting at the start, became in the course of events not just a promise, but a burden. The demands of this obligation brought church members from New York State to Missouri and began their movement to the west. In a millennial outburst of faith, the first Mormons had sought the remnant, and their quest shaped their movement's history. Bottom line is, I believe that Joseph knew. I don't think that it was any coincidence that, and I don't see any indication 5 days before his death that he had evolved at all when it came down to the geography of the Book of Mormon, because he had those Indians in his own kitchen and told them that the Great Spirit had told him that they were, in fact, those people who are written of, and that their history is the Book of Mormon. So if there was any evolving going on, it was within the early brethren of the church. But there is no solid indication from historical documents that Joseph Smith ever claimed the Book of Mormon to have occurred in Central or Mesoamerica.
Okay, so any final comments about that?
A couple right on that theme.
Yeah.
Because in 1841, which was in the Times and Seasons, Joseph Smith gave his brother Don Carlos, that we talked about, he gave him those 8 essays from Oliver Cowdery and said, publish these again. And he did. I think it was March or April of 1841 that letter 7 was published in the Times and Seasons. So if he was evolving his ideas, he wasn't doing it in 1841.
Yeah.
And we already talked about how in 1842 he changed Orson Pratt's Mesoamerican stuff and said, no, they're the Indians that live in this country. So the idea he was evolving. But you know, what this brings up, though, is this whole idea that Joseph Smith was ignorant and speculating. And it wasn't just about the geography, it's also about the translation. Because they're saying he wasn't capable of translating anything. He had to read this words off the stone.
He was ignorant.
Yeah. And so it's all kind of a piece of the same intellectual trend. Whereas, you know, we've discussed before, not in this podcast so much, about the translation, how important it is to, well, just like the Wentworth letter was edited to take out that reference, in the Gospel Topics essays on the translation, they omitted everything Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said about the translation. It's like, how does anyone...
The two most knowledgeable people on the planet, other than Jesus Christ himself.
It's just unbelievable. And so,
why
as a
would we
result,
omit those things?
it's also out of the standard of truth they don't put in there. So when you have people who are trying to learn church history and what happened, and they're given these materials that just delete whatever Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said, they're susceptible to things like this Mesoamerican or the stone in the hat stuff, because they don't know any different.
I got a couple of other things I just wanted to point out. So when you were doing the last interview of Zarahemla, one of the things that I wish I would have had for this 15 years ago was the time when Benjamin Winchester got silenced.
Yeah.
Do you want to address that for just a second?
Well, he got reprimanded and silenced. He was censored.
And the time frame was right in this same time frame when these articles were going out.
That's right.
The first ones came out in the spring.
Yep.
Then Joseph Smith called him to repentance.
Well,
basically.
Here's the sequence. So he came out to Nauvoo and got chastised, and we don't know what that was about. But there was an entry in the Quorum of the 12 Minutes in the spring that said, from Joseph Smith, and he said, words to the effect that once Benjamin Winchester gets in a course, you can't get him out of it.
Yeah.
And Winchester had been talking about this new course in dealing, talking about promoting Mesoamerica, right?
Yeah.
And then he was publicly censored in the Times and Seasons.
Which is really interesting. If you actually pull these up and look at it, it's like this is the ensign of its day.
Yeah, that's right.
Here's Benjamin Winchester is hereby silenced, and it's got all the names of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles all right there. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness! I mean, this guy got seriously,
he was
censored.
A troublemaker.
And but he did stay, at least on paper, so to speak. He repented and kind of said, okay, I won't do that again.
Yeah, and he got reinstated.
The next time that was interesting, and this is something I found out after this as well.
Yeah.
I think it was maybe from you. No, it's actually before that, but after I did this, but before I knew you and your research, that the second time when he did this, Joseph Smith actually shut down the Times and Seasons. And he had, there's actually one, there's the one that was missing. There was a gap in there. He shut it down. He fired.
He resigned from the Times of Seasons.
And didn't he fire Winchester?
Yeah, William Smith.
William, his brother, fired him.
He fired him. That's after that Zarahemla article came out.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff in this book. I mean, brothers and sisters, you just got to get a copy of The Lost City of Zarahemla.
Yeah.
I hope we have enough printed or whatever for that. But it is just phenomenal information.
It is, and it deals specifically with the foundation of the Meso thing.
Yeah.
But there's another aspect of it that we didn't touch on that we should.
Yeah.
And that is, where did this idea of two Comoras come up? Because if you read these people back in the 1840s, they still believed Cumorah was in New York.
Yeah.
They just believed in a hemispheric model.
Before we jump off of Benjamin Winchester, though, there was one statement that you found from Joseph Smith in regard to Benjamin Winchester's character.
Okay.
Which you've got to share that,
because
this is so important. Because if you're gonna rely on Benjamin Winchester, if he really was the author of these articles, you're going to rely on him for your geography information, then you need to know what Joseph Smith said about him.
I hope I can find that in here.
I can quote part of it.
Yeah.
About being rotten.
Having a black heart and all that.
Rotten at heart. And would injure the church as much as he could.
That's what he said.
That's what he said. Now, I don't remember, though, was that in the Times and Seasons or was that somewhere else?
No, he said that somewhere else.
Okay, that's what I thought.
I'd have to look it up because, he did say that's what Joseph said.
That Benjamin Winchester is rotten at heart and would injure the church as much as he could.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
and he did actually do that.
He did, yeah. That was like a prophetic statement.
Partly with these articles.
Yes, that's right.
But also he ended up coming out, apparently one of his sisters was a polygamous wife of Joseph Smith. And he freaked out about that. He and William Smith got in litigation against each other because when William Smith went out to New York to publish the newspaper out there called The Prophet, he asked Benjamin Winchester to contribute articles. That was another clue I had, that he'd been doing the same thing in Nauvoo.
Okay.
He actually solicited material from Benjamin Winchester. But a few months later, the two of them started arguing about something, and they ended up suing each other, and William Smith
was going to get credit for this or that?
Well, I don't remember what it was. They were accusing each other of libel or something.
Yeah.
But then Winchester came out to Utah and started talking about how terrible Joseph Smith was, and that he'd known him all along, and he was a scoundrel and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Where at the time he was campaigning for Joseph for president, and they were real close. But then later he had a black heart, like Joseph said, and tried to injure the church as much as he could. And so that's why I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually hadn't thought about that in a while. But if he really was the source of these articles, which I think the evidence is pretty obvious, and Joseph Smith said he was going to injure the church as much as he could, what could injure the church more than misdirecting us on the whole geography of the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. Another thing I thought was interesting is that John Page was another one that in the book you mentioned about how early on Winchester and John Page had gotten together, and John Page tried to take credit for Winchester's theory about the Book of Mormon happening in Central America. And he wrote to Joseph Smith and so forth, I've come up with this new theory. And so forth. That was so beautiful, because the two of them started arguing about who was going to get credit for pushing Joseph Smith into the Mesoamerica thing, which there's no evidence that he ever did. But they hated each other after a while.
Eventually,
did they? Now, was it those two? Did they also sue each other? I don't remember.
I don't remember those two suing each other.
But the bottom line is, brothers and sisters, is that the whole Mesoamerica theory, the foundations of it came from people who were excommunicated, had apostatized, hated Joseph Smith.
Well, but to be fair,
Benjamin Winchester also said that he was going to drink Joseph's blood. I think at one point was that.
No, that wasn't
Winchester. Who was? No, that was Hurlbut.
Yeah, it was Hurlbut.
That was Hurlbut. Okay.
But to be fair, Orson Pratt was a major proponent of the whole hemispheric model, and he even put it in the footnotes in the Book of Mormon. So for 40 years, it was in the footnotes, where it said. Those footnotes are interesting though, because he declared it. In the footnotes, it was a fact that Cumorah was in New York, and that the mounds were from the Nephites and so on. But he said it is believed that Lehi landed in South America. It's believed that Zarahemla is in Colombia, that type of thing. So he just, even then, again, like Oliver Cowdery had done, Orson Pratt distinguished between fact and fiction or theory. And Cumorah was always a fact, even in the footnotes in the Book of Mormon. The Central and South American stuff was always just a theory or is believed.